The Ethereal Plane is really cool, and you should definitely be aware of it and how it operates for your games. Also, if you're not, there's potential that your players could abuse certain aspects of it. So let's jump into it. The first question, what is the Ethereal Plane? The Ethereal Plane is kind of the in-between. Some describe it as the glue that holds the universe together, but what does that even mean? There's not really maps or images I could find for the Ethereal Plane, because I don't think they exist, but here's a picture of the galaxy that I'm going to use as an example of the Ethereal Plane and how it works. So the Ethereal Plane is broken down into two parts. You have the Border Ethereal and the Deep Ethereal. The Border Ethereal is probably the area that your players will spend the most time in, and it's the part that overlaps with different planes. The Ethereal Plane is connected to multiple planes of existence. So you have the material plane, then you have the Shadowfell, the Fae, and then the other inner planes. The Ethereal Plane is connected to all of those, and the Border Ethereal is the part of the Ethereal Plane that overlaps with some of these other planes of existence. Then in this middle area, you have the Deep Ethereal. The Deep Ethereal, you only have 30 feet of vision as there's fog and mist that clouds that. There's no gravity, and you don't move through physical means. You move through sheer willpower. You will yourself to move, and that's how you travel. In the Deep Ethereal, to get into the border, there are curtains, and the different colored curtains tell you which border you're entering. You use your willpower to move yourself. Distance is meaningless. It's impossible to track speed, and pretty much impossible to track the passage of time as well. But DM, I have the keen mind feat, so I would know how long till the next sunrise. Very true, but there aren't any sunrises or sunsets in the Deep Ethereal for you to gauge the passing of time from. So it just doesn't work? The Border Plane is where your players will most likely be spending the majority of their time in the Ethereal Plane. While in the Border Ethereal, your vision doubles as the fog isn't as thick here, so you can see as far as 60 feet out. It's described as looking through a frosted glass, and you're looking into the overlapping plane of existence. So if you're at the border for the material plane, you could see buildings and creatures in the material plane, but only 60 feet out. The colors are dulled and meld together, and similarly to the Deep Ethereal, there's no gravity, you float. Though here you can gauge the passing of time and distance as it does relate to the material plane, or whatever plane of existence you're bordering. So the question you may be asking is, why would your players want to go into the Ethereal Plane? So moving forward, we're going to focus mostly on the Border Ethereal, specifically bordering the material plane. There's a couple reasons, and this is why you need to be aware of how it works. The first is spying, reconnaissance. Someone in the material plane cannot see or hear anyone in the ethereal plane unless they have special abilities to do so. These little fish people can do it, and some creatures with like true sight. But for the most part, most people won't be able to see. So you can safely spy from the safety of the ethereal plane. The safety of the ethereal plane. The next thing that you can do is use it to infiltrate bases, because you can just float through walls. The only thing you can't go through are living creatures or beings. And note that trees and things like that do count. So if you have a fortress that's covered in vines and things like that, it is safe from ethereal penetration. Another thing to consider if you're going to be doing this with your big baddie and you want your fortress protected from ethereal penetration, you could try going the route of Rick and Morty and just strapping people to the outside of it, but they do have to be kept alive. So this is one of the reasons why it's good for you, the Dungeon Master, to know how the ethereal plane works, because if your big baddie knows how the ethereal plane works, they would also be aware of how people could use that to sneak in, and they might have precautions against it. You might homebrew a specific material or alloy that you can't walk through the ethereal plane as well, but that's up to you to decide. There's also some magical effects that can accomplish the same thing. The last reason your players may want to go into the ethereal plane is to get away or protection. This is also why monsters will often go into the ethereal plane. A ghost, if it's going to die, it might just pop into the ethereal plane and run away. So that is a very useful aspect of it. Now, how do you get into the ethereal plane? The most common way is with the 7th level spell, either plane shift or etherealness. but there's a few other methods. If you wanted to go up to a 9th level spell, Gate can get you in, and you can temporarily go into the Ethereal Plane with the 3rd level spell, Blink. There are some others, but those are the most common ways that people get into the Ethereal Plane. Blink is one of those that doesn't make any logical sense if a turn is about 6 seconds and they're in the material plane for the full 6 seconds to do all of their actions, bonus actions, movement. I don't know at what point they're not in the material plane and they're blinked out, but that spell you could consider broken, and this is one of the things that if you understand how the Ethereal Plane works, you can kind of bring that down a little bit. The Ethereal Plane should be scary, and there are some dangers into the Ethereal Plane. It's not to say that your players should never go into the Ethereal Plane and it's certain death, but there should be a little bit of caution before dipping into this other plane of existence. Starting off with the Border Ethereal, because if you're using Blink or Etherealness, that's where you're going. You have creatures that are dangers. Ghosts live in the Ethereal Plane. That is kind of where they live. They dip into the material plane, but they're a bit more common in the Ethereal Plane and almost guarantee you will attack any people traveling through the Ethereal Plane. The next, you have things like phase spiders that can dip in and out, and many other fey creatures, because that's not the only thing. Night hags can also go into the Ethereal Plane, and there's even some other things like a succubus or incubus can also use etherealness and go into the Ethereal Plane. There is a chance that your players run into any of these kinds of creatures whenever they go into the Ethereal Plane. So if you don't like the way that Blink works, if you think that it's too strong, maybe every time they use the Blink spell or every time they enter the Ethereal Plane, you roll a d12 and on a 1, you have an encounter. This also means that you should have a random encounter table for the Ethereal Plane. I have a random encounter table for the Ethereal Plane, so drop a comment below if you'd be interested in seeing that. I also like creating some other monsters that solely live in the Ethereal Plane. And because there's no gravity, I think it's cool adding things like sharks that just swim through the Ethereal Plane. But that's just me. Another creature that you should be aware of that can dip into the Ethereal Plane is a nightmare, which is a fiend horse. Your players can use this themselves to get into the Ethereal Plane if you want to give them access to it at lower levels, but it is a fiend horse that's typically evil, so they may have a hard time getting it to cooperate. But your baddies, if you have a person or creature that can't necessarily get into the Ethereal Plane, if there's someone that could ride a horse, maybe you just slap them on a nightmare and they can now roam the Ethereal Plane. These dangers aren't just for the Blink spell, but all of the previous spells mentioned. And I don't give this tip to try to prevent players from using the Ethereal Plane to scout ahead or to infiltrate bases or sneaking past people. Not at all. But it shouldn't be necessarily always their go-to, like let's just always be in the Ethereal Plane because it's safe and we don't have to worry about getting attacked. The Ethereal Plane should have its own dangers. The next is if they go into the Deep Ethereal, there are some other dangers there. There could be other travelers traveling through the Deep Ethereal. The book gives examples for elementals, genies, and salamanders, though you could also add some more for your world if it feels appropriate. The next is they also have ether cyclones, which are these big storms or kind of like tornadoes, and they have a table that you can roll on for what happens when a character gets hit by one. It could scatter the party, hurl them into the astral plane, or just slow them down. The last danger I want to mention is that you could miss my future videos like the one I'm currently working on the Shadowfell if you don't hit the subscribe button. I hope you like this video and I'll see you next time.